Hi there, it's Kathy Missildine, and this week we're going to be talking about Total Rewards, specifically the compensation piece of Total Rewards, because I find that area can give some students a little bit of angst because it has some analytical concepts, and there's not too many people that have spent time in the compensation arena. So I think it's important that we understand these concepts. So as usual, I will be using the functional area number for Total Rewards PowerPoint if you want to get those and follow along. So we won't hit the key terminology because I'm sure you guys read that and understood that. So when we're talking about total rewards, it's really fascinating because it hits on so many things in the workplace. When we were talking about acquisition and retention, obviously compensation is a part of that. If we don't have a fair market-based compensation structure, it's going to be difficult for us to attract talent because talented individuals can almost command their own salary, correct? Or at least a fair salary. And then as far as retention, we've got to make sure that the career development piece is there, the incentives, the merit pay for performance is all in alignment. So we keep those individuals engaged and fairly compensated while they work for us. And so I believe the slide on slide number 4 is really important because when we're thinking about an overall total rewards system, and that does include benefits, obviously, because that's part of it, we want to make sure that the system is compatible with the organization's strategy. So in other words, thinking about your own companies, what if you have a growth-related strategy, which many companies do right now coming out of the recession? If we have a growth-related strategy, then we want to make sure we have a compensation plan that incents growth, whether it's revenue, whether it's profitability, whether it's market share. So you can see how compensation plans can be designed around sales, around new business, things of that nature. So that's why it's so important to make sure that's aligned. It has to be compatible with organizational culture, and the book mentions entitlement-oriented versus contribution-oriented. So that's very, very interesting. And some of the last 5 or 6 projects I've been involved in is moving a culture that is more entitled to one that is more performance-based. So in other words, when we talk about entitled culture, we talk about cultures that typically expect an increase every year just because that person shows up to work. It's not based on performance or based on results. Now, believe it or not, these cultures still exist. They're not prevalent. I don't see them as much as I used to, but they do still exist. So really making sure that our culture values accountability, it values performance, results, all those sort of things. That the compensation and reward structure with the benefits is compatible with the workforce. So let's say, for example, we're a startup in Silicon Valley, and we have very young entrepreneurial staff, average age 23. Do you think they're that concerned about a rich benefits package? Probably not. So maybe a more cash-rich package for them would be something that would incent them to come and stay. So what is appropriate for the workforce? It has to be internally and externally equitable, and that's a theme that we'll be talking about through the whole 12 weeks. We talked about it when we were talking about talent acquisition and retention, the idea of fairness, the idea of treating people the same, and this also flows through compensation, because if you're going to have issues around fairness, it's typically going to be in the area of somebody's making more than me and we're doing the same thing, whether it's between races, whether it's between genders. And so when we talk about internal equity, we're talking about the same jobs paying the same money for the same exact knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so, that old adage where employees don't talk about their compensation is over. Compensation is pretty transparent these days with the information we get on the internet and things of that nature, and they just discuss it. So we need to get over that, right? Externally equitable means are we competitive in the marketplace? So if we're in the if we're in the healthcare business and we're a hospital, thinking about all the hospitals in Atlanta, there's many, many, many hospitals. And if we're not paying nurses the market rate, do you think that we would be getting the um, most talented nurses out there? Probably not. And so that's why we have to be internally and externally equitable. And we'll talk more about how to do this and how to accomplish this further on in the presentation. Okay, so thinking again, we're kind of up in the more strategic level with pay strategies. And so you have to decide what's your company's philosophy going to be as far as the whole total rewards package. Do you want to match the market? Do you want to lead the market? Or do you want to lag the market? Now, there's times when all three of those may be appropriate depending on industry, location, type of business, things like that. So if you're a startup, you're an entrepreneurial firm, you're starting up, and that's kind of risky for an individual, for a talented individual. So you might have to lead the market, whether through salary, bonus, ownership. So you might have to lead the market to be able to attract that talent. Most companies, I will tell you, most of my clients in today's economy, we can pretty much match the market unless we are in an industry that has a serious talent shortage, like certain types of engineers, nursing. There used to be a nursing shortage. So with those professions, you might have to lead to be able to even get any talent. Lagging the market, there's a lot of, let's just face it, there's a lot of industry that lag the market. Nonprofit, just because they're nonprofit and they can't afford salaries, but they attract people that are in it for the good work. So there's sort of trade-off there. Government, government does in some circumstances lag the market, but they make up for it in the rich benefits package. So again, a trade-off depending on what that individual is seeking. So that's one of the first questions you have to ask yourself. Where are we going to be in terms of compensation? It'll be very interesting for you now that you've read this chapter or this book on compensation, to ask yourself, where do you think your company is as far as these three strategies: lead, lag, or match? The next slide talks about what are the global issues and what is your approach to compensation globally. If it's ethnocentric, we're just going to transfer what we do at headquarters out to the rest of the locations. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Polycentric, more likely to have integrated and consistent policies within each subsidiary. Regiocentric, greater potential for consistency within a region. So I think a lot of global companies have to do that to remain competitive. And then geocentric, more likely to have strategies consistent with global policies. And then, for those of you that work in global companies, I think it does add an extra layer of complexity to the compensation issues. For those reasons, on slide 7, are we going to be standardized? Are we going to be localized? What's going to be best for us for our location in China, India, Europe, wherever? What's the culture? What is the culture? Is it, how dissimilar is it from U.S. cultures? Do we have a culture of entitlement? Do we have a culture of performance? And that does vary really by country. What is the competitive labor market like? Are we fully employed? Are we underemployed? Is there a skill gap? What about unions? Are they prevalent in this area? What are the economic factors? Do we have high GDP, low GDP? What has the economy been like over the last few years globally? We know what that is. What's taxation like? Is it greater than the U.S., lower than the U.S.? And then what are the different employment laws? So you have to become, very familiar with all of that. And then I think another major topic when you're still thinking strategically about compensation and total rewards both is, what is our communication plan? I think for so long when I got into HR, compensation was kind of that hush-hush topic. Don't tell anybody, don't talk about it. But today, with the new generations, the millennials coming in the workplace, That's not a good strategy anymore because they're more open about things like that. So slide 10 talks about what are, educating employees on what the compensation practices are. Make sure you have their buy-in and they're aware of their overall value. Things like giving them benefit statements at the end of the year, because not only do they get a salary, but the company is also responsible for certain portions of taxes, workers' comp insurance, certain portions of the benefits. And when they see all that totaled up, typically you're looking at salary plus anywhere from 30 to 40% on top of that the company's paying. So once they see that, they can understand the value. Obviously, it's supporting the organization's strategic initiatives. And the more we communicate that, the better. And it supports the goals for performance management. So if we've got organizational goals that have growth attached to it, then we also need to make sure that performance management goals is linked into that as well. That's really important. And then if we're true pay for performance, we will be paid on the achievement of those goals. The next slide, slide 11, is a big consideration, I think. Some companies are there as far as transparency in compensation where, here's our compensation structure, here's your grade, this is, what you make. And it does support the achievement of business objective. It reduces conflicts amongst employees because everybody knows. But then the bad side on all this, there's the good and the bad. The bad side is sometimes there may be jealousy, performance problems, because, everybody feels like they should be making the most, right? That they're the most qualified, that their performance is the best. Performance is personal. So when you start talking about that, people get a little, defensive, I think. Poses a risk that information may be used for inappropriate or unintended purposes, maybe to give it to outside competitors so they know what you're paying. Requires protection of employee privacy and the proprietary confidential information. And it raises individual and cultural concerns about fairness in the global environment. So again, I wish I had like $1 for every time we've talked about fairness in these videos, because, it's one of those concepts that we just take for granted in employment. But it's one that's so important, especially when we're talking about motivation in the workplace and performance. It's so linked and tied to that. So it's really important that we do all we can in HR to make sure that our policies and procedures are carried out in a fair and equitable manner. And I don't think I'll say that again. I'm just kidding. So, still talking strategically, how do you evaluate your total reward system? So you design it, it's linked to organizational objectives. How do you evaluate? On slide 13, is it compliant? Are we making sure that we are in compliance with FLSA, overtime, non-exempt versus exempt, all those sort of things? Is it compatible with the mission and the strategy of the organization? Did we do our job in alignment? Does it fit our culture? Is it appropriate for our workforce? Is it internally equitable? And there's measures we can look at that, and we'll talk about those. And is it externally competitive? And there's ways to do that, and we'll be talking about that. So those are the ways we can evaluate. So then the next question becomes measures, metrics, and analytics on the next slide. So, I think what I love about this new material is in each section we're going to be talking about metrics, and I think that's more than important. But I want to also say that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of metrics out there for each area within HR, with recruiting, with compensation, with benefits, employee relations, learning and development, all of those. There's so many metrics. And this slide does a pretty good job of saying, are the metrics the ones that are the ones that are correct, or the ones that matter? Are the metrics providing you with the information and insight to make informed decisions? What are you doing with the information that you are gathering regarding this data? So if you've decided that you're going to lead the market as your compensation philosophy, and you do some calculations, and we'll be talking about it, called compa ratio, and you find out that you're not, well, then what action are you going to take based on that? Because the data doesn't match your philosophy. So I think it's really important to understand what metrics are important or what metrics matter to your organization. So then the slide at the bottom of page 16 is really important. I want you to do whatever you need to to bring your attention to that slide. Because, when we were talking about talent acquisition and retention, we touched on job analysis, and I did make a point to say, job analysis is a very important procedure, but this slide sort of shows the flow with how it's interrelated with other activities, specifically compensation and total rewards. So looking at the slide, first job is job analysis. Identifies job task and qualifications of the people doing the job, the incumbent. So that's the study of the jobs. From that, we have job descriptions and specifications that set expectations with our workforce. Well, our job's not over yet. After we look at that, we then have to perform a job evaluation, which is this study of how much the job is worth. That's where we put dollars to jobs. And that's where we find out if we're internally equitable and externally competitive by doing these studies. Looking at jobs across the organization to see the variation. And why do we have variation? If we have variation, it should be because one's performing better than the other, correct? And so that's the sort of thing we have to do. And then finally, once you assign values to the particular job, you're then ready to create your own pay structure with grades, with midpoints, maximum, minimums, and all those kind of decisions. So it's really a fascinating process. I really do love this process, I guess because my background has been primarily the more analytical parts of HR. So when we start talking about data and compensation, that's areas of passion for me. It's very, very interesting. And so again, talking a little deeper about job analysis on slides 17, 18, and 19. The goal is to get to the knowledge, skills, and abilities like we talked about before. And thinking about you're gathering information about what's the job context, the purpose of its job, its environment, its content. What are you doing on an everyday basis? The qualifications, the specification. What is enabling that person to be successful in that job? And then finally, what is the performance criteria? What are the desired behaviors or results that will constitute success on that job? And that's where you can get into the competency discussion as well, because remember the delineation between knowledge, skills, and abilities and competencies are more behaviorally based. And so how do you do a job analysis? We did not get into that in our last discussion. And again, like I said before, awesome exercise. You can learn a lot. And if you look at slide 19, it goes into what are the more common methods. Well, you can observe the person doing their job. You can interview that person. You can do an open-ended questionnaire, which is, as you can imagine, the more jobs you have, the more difficult that becomes to weed through all that information. Highly structured questionnaires, which I recommend with a combination of maybe interview if you have further questions, and then work diary or log. So I just want to bring out some challenges with some of these methods. So as you can see, observation and interview would take a lot of time. So it depends on resources, money, things of that nature. When you're asking an individual to fill out details about their job, you have to remember you're going to have a certain bias. So if it's a work diary or log, they might leave things out. They might embellish things. An open-ended questionnaire, there's no telling what you get. So that's probably my least favorite. The highly structured questionnaire, an example of one is called the PAC form. It's called a position analysis questionnaire. And depending on the job, supervisory, non-supervisory, tons and tons of detailed questions that get to that sort of detail that you need around the job. For me, it kind of strikes a balance between time and objectivity that you need in this process. And then, of course, the outcomes, which we talked about before, descriptions, specifications, and competencies. So number 20 is another one of those slides that I really think you need to pay attention to. I think I talked about it last time when we were in talent acquisition about how job analysis can cross so many areas in HR, and this is what that slide depicts. So in the middle, you have job analysis, and from that, you have staffing, You have training because you know what the job content is. You have performance management. You can set the job criteria and the job standards. Safety and health. You know what the environment is and what the context of the job in case there's some safety training that needs to go along as well. What are the rewards? Employee relations issue because of the hierarchy of the jobs. Legal compliance. Are we compliant with the ADA and things of that nature? And so, again, there's not too many areas that job analysis do not influence within HR. So that's the first step. We're going to complete a job analysis. And then slide 21 is we get into job evaluation. How do we figure out how much a job is worth? So if you look at that definition at the top of 21, determines the value and price of a job in order to place and compare it with an organization as well as, there we go, attract and retain employees in a competitive environment. So it's a critical process because I think about some of the clients that I have that haven't done compensation studies or haven't done market surveys to look at their compensation data. Well, it's old, and so they're trying to attract talent on 2005 prices. Well, that doesn't work anymore because the 2015 talent understands what they're worth because they've gone onto the internet and done a Google search. And so we have to be very cognizant of keeping our data fresh so that we can acquire and that we can retain. Job evaluation is also called a job valuation. That makes sense. So the next slide, 22, is the internal ways on how to do a job evaluation. So there's non-quantitative methods, in other words, methods that use more judgment than data. So those methods are called whole job methods, and they try to establish what are the relative order of jobs. In other words, this one's the most important CEO, he should be paid the most. Then there's executive vice presidents, then there's vice presidents, then there's directors, managers, so forth and so on. Evaluate the entire job and sequence of jobs in the hierarchy in which they should be of value to the organization. So it puts it in order in terms of value. So some different examples and more details in the book is job ranking, paired comparison, and job classification. So as you can imagine, as I told you, I'm pretty data driven. Those are not my favorite methods. And quite frankly, they're not the most common, but obviously you need to know they're out there. The quantitative methods try to establish how much a job is worth more or less than another job by using a scaling system or a point system. They evaluate certain factors called compensable factors on a scale and provide a score, which I love because that's defendable or defensible in court, that indicates how valuable one job is compared to another. And one of the most popular ones is called the point factor system or the Hay method. You probably have heard about that. So in my example before, the CEO might score 500 points and the reception might score 300 points. I'm sorry, 200 points. So it's on a kind of point system where you can, again, you have the score using a form like a pack form and put all those in orders. And of course, you do have to do some manual adjustment because, it's not a perfect science, but, the HR professionals know the jobs better than anybody else, and so does the manager. So this is an iterative, collaborative process to be able to get this right. So that is why, unfortunately, it's not done very often because it takes time and obviously it takes resources, both internal and external, most of the time. All right, then the most one of the most popular ways to do job evaluation when you're looking at the external market is to do what you call a market pricing. That is on slide 23. You collect data, including survey data from different companies that do this. Watson Wyatt, Towers Perrin, Hay Group. You need professional organizations that may have data like that. So you look at all that data and determine, where you are as far as the market is. If you've decided you're going to lead and you get back the data and it says you're not leading anymore, you've got to make some decisions. And so, a lot of folks will do external surveys only, and not internal surveys because we're trying to be competitive. So that's what slide 24 is talking about. When you're choosing between internal and external surveys, the internal time and expertise that's required. The relevance and match of external survey jobs to the organizational jobs, because sometimes we have very, very specific jobs and it's hard to find that in the market data. How current is the external data? I find that companies that do that as their expertise, they have pretty current data. And then the expense of the survey versus the expense of handling that internally. So once you get the data from, either you do it in-house internally or you have hired someone externally to do that, you might need to do some data kind of analysis with that. It may need to be aged, leveled, and or factored for geography. So in other words, aging moves it. Say you did get salary data and it was for 2013. We're in 2015 now, and we need to move that data by 3% because we have information that's credible that says there is a 3% upswing in compensation from 2013 to 2015. So we would take our ranges and move them by 3%. Leveling happens when we were talking about you've got a job that's so specific to your company that it's really hard to find a comparator job out in the market. So we had one when we were doing a compensation survey for a water company. And so they had engineers that were very specific around wastewater. So as you can imagine, those aren't a very prevalent title when you're looking at survey data. And so we had to take, it was 80% like this job and 20% like this job. So we leveled that data to come up with what is the market price for that job. And then, wage rates definitely vary by location. New York, higher cost of living, compensation is higher than what you would see in Atlanta. West Coast is typically higher than what you would see on the East Coast. So understanding those differences is very important when you are a national company, and you can multiply that by 10 if you're a global company, because there's all sorts of data concerns or survey concerns when you're looking at data across the globe. Now, the next few slides, I don't want you to get too caught up in, these are, how you look at salary data and how you can analyze salary data. I think it's really, really good information. I really do. So we'll take this, pretty thoroughly. So I'm making sure that you understand it. So looking at slide 27, this is when you're sorting salary data. So this is a sample of, let's just pretend this is a sample of engineers in our department. And what it's telling us that most of the engineers in our department, 5 of them are making 70 grand, correct? We've got 2 people making 55 and 2 people making 65, and then we've got 1 at 75. So what we've done is grouped the engineering department data from their mean salary from lowest to highest. So if I was looking at that data, I would say, okay, well, it looks like the max of this position is 75. We've got 1 person at 75, but we've got 5 getting close to the max. Could that be an issue? Well, if these engineers are hard to find, you bet it could be an issue because they know they're getting close to the max. And so do you think they should have a career development plan? Absolutely, or we might be at risk. So for me, that's pretty telling data. And then what I would also like to know is the 2 people at 55, are they low performers? Are they new people? Do they need more training to move up the scale? So when you do data like this, when you analyze data like this, what happens is you get more, usually you get more questions to go and research and find out what's going on. So that's why it's important. So the next slide talks about weighted and unweighted average. So same data set. If you're talking about an unweighted average, it gives equal weight to each salary. So that's how we've always done averages, right? You add them all up, you divide by the number of salaries, correct? Well, the weighted average considers the number of people who are receiving that salary. So you add them all up, and instead of dividing by 5, you're going to divide by the 11 because you've got 2 plus 1 plus 2 plus 5 plus 1, and that's 11. So you see the difference. It's not much, but it is a little difference in weighted versus unweighted. And then finally, the median is the middle number in the range or the 50th percentile. And so in that range from 55 to 75, if that's a true range, the median would be 65. We've got two ranges up and 2 ranges down. Mode is the most frequently occurring wage. So in our example, the mode is 70. So just make sure you know the difference between weighted and unweighted, median and mode. And then next, what you'll see is a terminology of quartiles and percentiles. And that's when you're looking at a range. So a salary range runs from point A to point B. Point A is the minimum. B will be the maximum. And right in the middle, we have the midpoint. And usually the midpoint is grounded by market. So in other words, if the market data's come back and said for an engineer, you should be paying that engineer $65,000. That's what the market data says. That's the median or the midpoint of the range. That's where we'd set our midpoint in the organization. So if you look at this, the range here, they've got it divided up into fourths. So your first quartile, your second quartile goes up to 50%. Your third quartile is 75% of the range. And finally, in your fourth quartile. This also shows you if you are leading, lagging, or matching the external data, because remember, the midpoint is external data. And if you have everybody clustered down in the first or second quartile, they're lagging. That's not leading or matching, right? And so this can give you a lot of information about where your people are, what needs to happen next, all that sort of thing. And so let's take a look at compa ratios. That's where I wanted to go to next because that's really important. Slide 32. Compa ratio is a metric that tells you where you are in relation to market or midpoint. So look at the example. Given a range of $16 to $20 an hour, a midpoint of 18, and a salary of 16, the compa ratio is 16 divided by the midpoint, which is 18, equals 0.89 or 89%. That tells you you're paying that individual 89% of the market. So in this economy, that might be a bad thing because they could leave and make 11% more somewhere probably. And so compa ratios below 1 mean wages are below midpoint. Compa ratios greater than 1 means we're exceeding the midpoint. Really important to understand that concept. And it's a really cool measure to see where you guys are as far as your compensation versus your strategy. So that'll be something easy for you guys to go calculate if you don't have anything else to do, right? So once you get all the information, all the data, according to slide 31, you start establishing your pay grades, and there's no magic number. I've seen 10, 15. I think once you get past 20, that's a little much, and you don't have that much difference between pay grades. And then you set the ranges. What's the upper, the lower, and of course we know what midpoint is. A good rule of thumb is usually those ranges range between about 60%, a spread of 60% on the range from the minimum to the max. Broadbanding is a type of range setting. Broadbanding combines 2 or more salary grades to create larger ranges, and give people more latitude to move within their job without growing the pay scale. So it gives you more real estate. In other words, maybe your minimum is 20,000, but your max is 75. So it gives you a long time to move across that scale. On slide 34, you can see the advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, the wider scale reduces the number of grades, and it can enhance employee mobility, but on the disadvantage side, it's less control. The ranges are too broad. People don't understand it, but it really has a lot of confusion around equity. Here I am, I'm in the same range. He's making 50 and I'm only making 30. So again, it really is confusing to employees, and they really have a lot of questions about that. Broadbanding was pretty popular back in the 90s. Don't see it too much anymore for those reasons. Now, the next several slides, talk about the different types of pay systems, and they're very straightforward. Matter of fact, I did add a forum question in our forum this week to describe one of these pay systems and talk about its advantages and disadvantages. So you've got base pay, single or flat rate pay, time-based pay, performance-based pay, my favorite, productivity-based pay, person-based pay. So just understanding what those are. I'm not going to go through those here on the video. Again, if you have questions posted in the forum, I have listed these in a separate forum to make sure that we are all understanding what those are. Pay variations. So when we're looking at our ranges, I'm on slide 41 now. When we're looking at our ranges and we've got people clustered to the maximum, those are red circle rates, or people that get over the maximum. Those are the people that are usually frozen and don't get any more increases till they move up. So is that a problem? Yes. Are they at risk for leaving? Yes. That's why we need to know that. Green circle rates are those people that are below the minimum, and you have to ask yourself, how did they get below the minimum? Are they not ready for that job? Do they need more training? Is it a performance issue? What is it? And then pay compression happens when there's small differences in pay, regardless of experience, skill, level, or seniority. So in other words, everybody's being paid the same, even if you've got more experience. So it's not really a pay for performance system. Everybody's clustered together. Remember, equity, fairness. If I'm doing more, if I have more experience, I expect to be what? Paid more. And then slide 42 goes into all the different pay adjustments. I believe the book did an excellent job in talking about those and what those were, as well as differential pay and incentive pay, the different types of incentive depending on what you're trying to do. And then obviously it talks about pay for performance, where that's where everybody has pretty much gone, is in this area of making sure that our incentives, our merit pay is tied to actual performance. And so the rest of the information talks about executive incentives, executive pay, how we pay our salespeople, and compensation for professionals. And so making sure that you guys understand that, and have any questions, definitely ask me. There is one concept I do want to bring up on slide 51. It's the dual ladder. Thinking about your managers, and let's think about the technology industry. So typically, if somebody's doing well, let's say at a help desk, they're great with the customer, they're really technical, they're certified 4 or 5 different ways from Sunday, and they're really good on the help desk. Well, what do we typically do with that person? Well, we promote them to manager. And that employee's going to say yes because it's more money. They feel like that's the only way to make more money, so they're going to be a manager. But really, what they love to do is sit on the help desk and answer calls. So what HR leadership did to answer that is, let's make it a dual ladder. In other words, if you're technical and you want to stay technical, let's make a ladder that you can promote from a technical place. Or if you're interested in management and love to manage people, we will also have a ladder that allows you to go up the management track. So you can still make money doing what you love to do. So that's dual ladder. And so that pretty much covers the major topics in compensation. The benefits section, is interesting. In this publication, it's a lot smaller than it was. So if you have any questions on the benefits portion, please let me know. So thank you, and I will talk to you soon in the next week.